That's definitely the attitude that I grew up with in a working class community, was this idea that using debt is irresponsible. And I think it's tied to that never wanting to be taken advantage of. And I imagine it's because we spend our whole lives as largely as Americans, but I think in particular in working class communities, that we spend our whole lives with the culture just taking advantage of us, constantly making us pawns and suckers and things. And so we're always looking for ways to avoid that humiliation a little bit.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Dana Miranda. I'm the author of You Don't Need a Budget and creator of the Healthy Rich Substack.
So this episode is basically a follow-up on an interview I did with you in the newsletter, and that interview spawned more than 300 comments. A lot of them really wrestled with concepts that we talked about in the newsletter, but I want to start from scratch here because not everyone who listens to the podcast is a newsletter reader. What is your framework for thinking about money and personal finances, just generally?
So I try to question a lot of what we see in traditional personal finance media and education. And what I see as sort of the conventional approach is something I call budget culture, which is kind of the money parallel to diet culture, where we sort of default to individual responsibility, restriction, and feel a lot of shame for when our financial circumstances are not what we'd like them to be. And so the work that I do is to try to name that and show that to people, and also to question the kind of advice that's coming through budget culture and question a lot of the assumptions that are being made.
I think that sometimes people mistake anyone talking about money and money advice on the internet as people who are like financial advisors. And you are always very keen to note, I am not a financial advisor. I am giving you some questions to work through in order to think through what you want your financial outlook to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a financial educator. That's what my certification is. My background is really in journalism. So I write about money, basically. And so I share information to help people make decisions for themselves, but without like actually being able to talk to someone individually and look at your finances, like dig into your bank account and things like that. It's really hard to give individualized advice. And that's a problem that I see in financial media and education in general. Is a lot of stuff is presented as advice, as sort of like universal advice, which with something as personal and individualized as money, there's really no way to give general advice because everybody's situation is so different. But when we hear things in that way, it feels like, well, I'm supposed to just be able to do this because that's what they said is like the baseline advice. Like making a budget is sort of treated like it's something that everyone can do and something that will work for everyone to improve whatever your financial situation is.
Yeah. And when I introduced our interview, I really tried to encourage readers to think of American budget culture in particular as an ideology that has been really thoroughly normalized. There's nothing natural about you must have a 401k, right? Like there's nothing natural about like debt is bad. Like why is debt bad? So like what we're trying to do today is work through some of those questions and interrogate like some things that have become normalized. And some of them have been normalized even in like the last half century. I was reading a piece of yours this morning that I loved about the 401k, and I think we'll get to this in the questions. But like the shift from certain types of jobs offering pensions and the risk of the pension and the risk of allocating money for future retirement, like that used to be on the employer. And it is only since the early 80s that we have shifted that risk onto the individual. And I think that like sometimes like I was born the year that a lot of these changes started to take place. So it's within our lifetimes that it has changed.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing to think that, especially as millennials, like these things we have always talked about as natural and normal and the way things that always are, but actually they're only about as old as we are, a lot of these economic changes.
Okay, so let's start with the questions, and I think we'll get to work through a bunch of different ideas as we go. Our first question today comes from Kaylin.
So first, I'd like to ask, where does basic bookkeeping and understanding your monthly cash flow to keep your checking account out of overdraft and budget culture begin? Second, I'd love to hear more on challenging budget culture in the context of budget tools marketed to white urban liberal types like You Need a Budget, YNAB, or Ramit Sethi's advice, as opposed to Dave Ramsey budget culture. I think there's a really valuable conversation to be had about the former, the liberal budget tools, let's say. But the framing in that first interview with Dana seemed to be more about the latter, the Dave Ramsey budget culture. And I think that just generated a lot of not all budgets type objections in the comments.
First of all, very perceptive comment from Caitlin. I want to compliment it because I think that did generate some of the tension in the comments, is like people being like, wait, you're saying I should never look at my credit card statement? Which I don't think is what you're saying at all.
No.
And then also that tension between those two types of budget tools, like You Need a Budget and like Dave Ramsey. So where do you want to start here?
I'll start with the first part of the question. Where does basically like understanding your monthly cash flow and budget culture begin? Because I think that is the biggest kind of point of tension when I'm having conversations with people. And a lot of it is semantics about how you're using the word budget. It's similar to the word diet. Budget can just refer to the money that you're using and that you have coming in and out. But the way that it tends to be used in the personal finance space is this spending plan, which inherently has restriction and discipline built into it. And that's generally what I'm talking about. So when I say you don't need a budget, or I'm working on budget free, or I'm anti-budget, it's because I want to counter the restriction and discipline that budgets tend to have built in, and the shame then that comes, from that. And I also think making a spending plan is part of that. Even though it sounds just inherently responsible, it is something that by its nature has restriction built in, because you're deciding ahead of time what you're allowed to spend money on. And if you change that, then that's kind of where the shame comes in, because you stray from your spending plan. And then when your finances aren't what you want them to be, then you have something that's kind of easy to blame, and it just comes around on you. Well, I didn't stick to my spending plan. Tends to not be very practical. Budgets are unsustainable, just in the same way that diets are. They're very hard to stick to because they're so restrictive, and just rely on human discipline, which is hard to have in everyday life. So that's kind of the difference that I see. But when you say like, I'm not saying don't ever look at your credit card statement or your bank account. Like, mindfulness and awareness about what's going on with your money is really important. And I think it's important to name budget culture and to start to question a lot of these conventional rules and ideas that we have about money, because it allows you to do those things like look at your bank account, look at the money you have coming in and out, without the shame that gets piled on top of it because of your ability to meet or inability to meet the rules that you think you're supposed to be following.
Yeah, like, I spent too much on books in my book bucket of money, and like that's a failure on my part. One thing that I think about with my own finances is, well, two things. One, and this is maybe similar to like some of the conversation around like quote unquote intuitive eating, is that like how much of the spending practices that I do without thinking consciously are things that were passed down to me by growing up in a middle class household where debt was okay and spending was okay, but also we had the means to accommodate both, and we had the privilege of good credit and that sort of thing. So like how much is it is just stuff that like I learned through observation or absorption or whatever. And then also like sometimes my partner makes fun of me because I still go to the grocery store like I'm a graduate student. Like I'm always looking for the slightly cheaper olive oil, like always. And we actually got in a big fight one time because I was like, you have never learned to look for the slightly cheaper olive oil, because he has never had to really watch his money in the way that, especially when I was in grad school, I did. And sometimes I'm like, I like that I have those tendencies, But then also I'm like, oh, that's like, the fact that I still sometimes I'm like, oh, well, I shouldn't get like that club salad because bacon is fatty. You know what I mean? Like things that I still have left over residually from absorbing so much diet culture when I was in my teens and 20s. So what does that make you think of?
I think it's exactly the same as trying to sort of transition to intuitive eating after a lifetime of being embedded in diet culture, that trying to spend mindfully without, just sort of flip that switch is pretty tough if your entire life you are hearing these budget culture messages, and especially because there's not a big conversation about it. And there's not a ton of places to turn to kind of work out these questions for yourself. So you just think like that finding the cheaper option is just the better way to go. There's also the flip side of just thinking, well, getting the thing that I want is the better way to go, right? Like that's also a positive thing. And that's also an important lesson that people need to know. I think just like with intuitive eating, that because of the culture that we're in under capitalism and the consumer culture that we're part of, that there's probably no perfect mindful spending that anyone can ever do. You're always like, why do you have 35 options for olive oil?
Yes.
There's, you're going for the cheaper one, but is it really that different from the 5 next to it?
Totally.
And that's not our fault. That's not the fault of your money management. That's a much bigger issue that we need to deal with. And so I think it's impossible to ever be perfect with any of that stuff, but it's good to question the kind of advice that you're getting that is rooted in restriction and shame, and start to pull away from that as much as you can. So if you're seeing yourself make the decision to get the cheaper olive oil, just take a moment and ask why that is. Is it because you feel like you don't deserve the indulgence of the better one? I think that's a really big thing to start to question. Yeah. Or is it because you just don't think that there's a difference and you could do something else with the extra $2 that you save?
And so much of this is psychological too, right? Like I just think of a lot of people in the comments or people that I've heard from who have a lot of money trauma from when they were growing up. And sometimes it's that their parents often got into credit card debt and like they were just like having to answer the phone and deal with collectors when you're 11 years old is going to change the way that you think about money. So it's hard to sometimes acknowledge, I think, just how complicated, naughty with a K, like how difficult money is in terms of like its psychological weight. Like people think like, oh yeah, like money is what makes everything in our lives. But at the same time, like there's a ton of trauma around it. There's a ton of like class privilege just in the way that we can even approach talking about money.
Yeah, there's so much. And it's really just as complex and nuanced as any other relationship that we have in our lives, our relationship with money, just like, again, our relationship with food. And it's one of those things that's just ever present. It's part of everything that we do. And one of the big beefs that I have with personal finance media and education is that it attempts to strip all that nuance out of our relationship with money and talk about it as if it can just be siloed into numbers and spreadsheets and financial goals and, optimizing investments and things. And that doesn't work for people because they have to try to fit that into all those complex experiences that we have with money.
So let's drill down a little bit on this difference between like You Need a Budget and Dave Ramsey. So I think some people don't know actually enough about Dave Ramsey to understand just how to understand the philosophy or how pervasive and how popular this philosophy is, especially amongst Christians. If you grew up evangelical, the chances that you are acquainted with Dave Ramsey is incredibly high. So give me an overview.
Yeah. So for a lot of people, Dave Ramsey is the first introduction into talking about personal finance. And he was very early in the space in doing that, coming in the early 90s with Financial Peace University. And he did something actually very good. I always feel like I have to credit him with this because I don't like pretty much anything else about his philosophy. But he came in at a time when financial media was for people who already had money. And it was just about how to invest better and grow your money more. And Dave Ramsey came along and spoke to people who just needed everyday money management guidance. And that was a huge thing. He kind of created the personal finance space that we see now. And so that was really helpful for people because he spoke in a way that kind of made sense and came up with some things that were about like motivating you to pay off debt rather than, just assuming you could use credit cards and pay them off at the end of the month or something. But what his advice has turned into, and I suspect just from kind of like a media and content standpoint, it happened this way because it was entertaining for people, is that especially on his radio show, he's just very harsh with people. So it's very black and white. People will call in for advice and just be kind of chastised about how they're using money.
He's just a dick.
Thank you, Melody.
I'll say it.
Yeah. It's very true. He's just not kind. And which is something that really kind of drives me crazy when I speak to people who are Christian or evangelical and follow Dave Ramsey, that I think he's just not a kind person. And so I don't understand how that brand kind of jives in that space.
Well, I think some people want to feel the shame, right? They're like, I'm a bad person because of my spending habits. Mm-hmm. Here's this like daddy who's going to shame me for it, and then I'm going to reform.
Right.
It's very to me, it's inextricable from some of like the shame and guilt that accumulates around evangelical culture. But, or even just the idea that like the more you can restrict yourself is always good, right?
Yes. And the struggle, there's like this inherent kind of need for struggle. I think also just like a set of rules is really appealing to a lot of people. And so when you just kind of lay out like black and white rules of exactly what you should be doing with your money, that's really appealing for people who are used to having a set of rules to follow. But also it's just appealing in the financial space where things are so nuanced and complex and there's so much that we don't understand. And money is something that has so much impact on our lives that if we can break that down and feel like we have a little bit of control because we're just following the right rules, that's very appealing. And so what others have done, like You Need a Budget, YNAB, Ramit Sethi with I Will Teach You to Be Rich, and a lot of other personal finance educators and influencers in the years since have sort of followed Dave Ramsey's blueprint on talking to more, sort of the average person about personal finance, but taken out the religious dogma to it and stepped outside of that. But they still kind of keep that focus on finding the right set of rules for people. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I find challenge, that I see is kind of the same across the board, and why I put YNAB in the same bucket as Dave Ramsey and Ramit Sethi, even though a lot of times they're using different language. They're not being as harsh with people about like, here is the right kind of life you should be living and exactly the things you should be doing with your money. Almost nobody takes as hard a stance on debt as Dave Ramsey does, which is it's just you cannot have debt, like pay off debt as fast as possible and don't accumulate anymore. Almost no one does that, but everyone lays out some new set of rules that they say, like it doesn't have to be this particular budget that everybody is critiquing now, but try this new budget or spending plan or method of money management, and this will be the right one. And it continues to kind of take that approach of trying to find a universal set of best practices for people.
Melody, do you want to share your experience with Dave Ramsey?
Well, this is super interesting to me because I went from Dave Ramsey to You Need a Budget, and I'm like a big YNAB head. But yeah, I took a Dave Ramsey class as a newlywed through my church at the time. And from like day one, I was like, this assumes that you have like extra money. This assumes that you have a job that pays you fairly. This assumes that you've never had a medical crisis in your life. And when I would like ask these questions, the facilitator would kind of be like, yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, but like, just, don't worry about that right now. And But the thing that was like appealing about it was, like Dana was saying, here is a step of rules, and if you follow these steps, you will get to financial freedom. Two things that I remember. It's also very like fear-based. And if you just do these things, like nothing bad will ever happen to you, or you'll be ready for the bad thing when it happens. One was like, look at this woman, like because she made smart choices for life insurance when her husband tragically died at 27 or whatever, like she didn't have to work for 2 years. And I actually like still think about that all the time. And then the other one that I was just like so outrageous was, you know, they show these little testimonials of people who followed all the rules and now their lives are great. And there was this one family like with children, and they're like, you know, we had so much debt, and so in order to get out of debt, we sold all the furniture in our house. We didn't have a couch for 7 years, but because we made those sacrifices, we were able to become debt free, and like now we're so happy. And I remember like my husband and I were just like, that, what? Like, you can never have anyone over. Like, why would you sacrifice like comfort and being hospitable and all of these things just for the sake of like not having debt? And so it encourages this like really extreme behavior and is also very fear-based.
Yeah, that is wild. I think one thing that YNAB, that people who do move to YNAB really evangelize about it, and what I see from Ramit also, is that they intentionally build in some more flexibility, which is really important. But again, in addition to kind of, they're still trying to find like the right set of rules, you know, you're just sort of moving to a new set of rules, but also almost no one is acknowledging the context that we're doing any of this in.
Totally.
Almost no one is acknowledging the financial system that we're dealing with that puts us in the precarious situations that we're in. Like if someone wasn't able to buy a couch for 7 years because they used money to pay off debt, like that's a very precarious financial situation, you know?
Right.
You can,
but
couches can
fault.
come pretty
like,
cheaply, but yeah.
Yes.
And Dave Ramsey says like, his big thing is like, that's just stupid. Like them buying a couch when they had debt to pay down would just be stupid.
Right. Well, and that's the thing that like I think when you focus on individual behaviors within this larger system instead of coming back over and over again to the structural, like I understand why people do it because it's the thing they can control. Right? Like I live within precarity. Like I live in a precarious capitalist society. What can I control? My own budget. But sometimes it's so easy to focus so much on the budget and on other individuals and their budgets that you lose sight of the larger structural critique and you don't vote that way, right? Like you don't advocate for change in that way because you are so focused on the individual.
Just like with diet culture, it creates a bias. Yeah. So, you know, everyone might think, well, budgeting works for me, so that's what I will continue to do. But if you continue to believe that and you don't take the time to question that larger structure, then you just have that bias built in and start to believe that other individuals should be able to control their financial circumstances too.
It's interesting to see this dynamic play out in the YNAB subreddit because you have people from all walks of life in there, and you'll have a 22-year-old who's like, okay, here's my budget, and like I still am barely paycheck to paycheck. Like, what do I need to be doing differently? And the advice is always just like, well, you just need to make more money. Like, why don't you do DoorDash on the side or some, you know, side hustles? And the individual examples, pushing back against the set of rules is like very eye-opening.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to switch gears just slightly. And one of the things that you talked about in the interview that I love is broadening your idea of resources. And I think this is particularly pertinent right now because a lot of people are freaking out about what's going to happen, what are they going to do, who are we going to depend on, all that sort of thing. So can you talk a little bit about that just general idea of broadening your resources, and then we'll get to the question?
Yeah. So, and Melody kind of mentioned it with YNAB too, is a lot of people just look at your income and your spending and just compare it to that. And so they say, if you are not able to spend what you want. You just need to earn more income. And I want to broaden the way that we look at resources to include not just income that you earn from working, because you might just be tapped out on that, or you might, for some reason, not be able to earn income from working, but also look at any assets that you have. So that can be things like a retirement account or a home, or anything that you could sell for money or tap into to earn more money. Also community and government resources, which we often connect a lot of shame to using, like nonprofit services in your area, government benefits, things like that, and debt resources. And that's probably the most controversial because it's also something we attach a lot of shame to. But when you look at what you have available to spend, I always encourage people to include what is your credit limit, what loans do you have access to, what home equity do you have access that you could tap into, because that can drastically change the cushion that you have before you actually like run out of money and don't have access to things. And it can really change your position if you realize that you have access to those kind of resources.
Yeah, I think oftentimes with something like even like a home equity loan or something like that, like it's like, well, if I'm paying like a percentage on this home equity loan, like that would otherwise be money like that I would be saving. And somehow like there's an imagined self who can save all of this money and who reaches this point on the graph at this point in their lives, right? And like you are falling short of imagined wealth person.
Yes.
And so every choice is not
self is a really great way to look at that.
Every choice is like not weighed between like what is actually going to make my everyday life manageable and survivable for me and my family for the next 2 years. It's instead like, well, but what if I have $10,000 less when I'm 67, right?
Right.
And that's hard. Like I understand why our thinking goes to that place, but also like really mean to your present self and family.
Right. And not as practical, I think, as it sounds.
Yes. Okay. So the question itself, let's hear from Letty.
How do you approach talking with friends about shifting from a more individualistic to the more community-oriented perspectives on money discussed in your interview?
So I love this because it's about like, okay, how do we actually have these conversations with each other? I would love to hear your thoughts here.
I love that. I'd actually love to hear your thoughts because I feel like you've actually been doing some research on like interpersonal relationships that is outside of my wheelhouse. But I think the starting place is shifting this conversation about resources. So shifting your understanding of what counts as resources. And we've talked a little bit about giving and generosity too. So shifting your understanding of ownership and accumulation and starting to think of anything, whether it's in your possession or it's money that you're earning through work or whatever, to start to think of resources as more communal. Yeah. So that as you have conversations with people, that's the point that you're starting from, rather than a lot of times we think about sharing and giving and even mutual aid as looking at the resources that I have and finding somebody who needs something. And there's always this kind of imbalance there of trying to find, who's needier than me that I can give money to or something, or am I needy enough to require assistance or something like that. But starting to think of it as just there's a communal pot of resources that we all kind of steward in our own ways. I think that's a really important starting point. And probably finding people who are already thinking that way too is a good start. It's going to be a big step to try to convince, people. Like I live in a rural, conservative, small town. I'm not having those conversations with people here because that's such a huge shift to start to talk about like community resources and mutual aid and things like that. Finding the people who are already in that mindset is going to be an important place to start.
So I actually think that's pretty interesting because I think sometimes people who live that way are actually more used to thinking about both your time and your possessions as things that are available to others. Like even the idea of like, this is going to sound weird to people who aren't familiar with this, but like hunting in a lot of places, you just figure out whose land it is. Like it's like a big swath of land. And if you want to go look for deer on that land, or if you want to go bird hunting on that land, like you just call up that person and you say, hey, can I hunt on your land? And they almost always, unless they're a huge curmudgeon, will be like, yes. right? Like, and this is the way that it works. But on a different scale, I would say that what I see come up a lot in the culture study comments threads, like the advice threads in particular, is a couple of things. One is people are very self-conscious, especially as they get into their 30s and 40s, about growing discrepancies in income and how to talk to their friends about it. And often the way that this gets resolved is it doesn't get resolved at all. And the people with more resources just start like doing things without the people without resources because they feel awkward. Like, oh, well, that person can't afford it, so we probably shouldn't like invite them and make them feel bad or whatever. And I think the advice that I've seen, and which I think is good advice, is just pay for that person's plane ticket, right? Like if you have enough money to go on like a girls' weekend to a place that requires a plane ticket, you probably have enough money to pay for that other person's plane ticket too, right? Don't make it a big deal. Just be like, I got this.
Yeah. I think it can be tough if you start to sort yourself, like you said, but also if that income and resource discrepancy is persistent throughout your relationship. Like that's actually a pretty simple thing for me to do with my friends because a lot of the people around me are freelancers. And so our incomes are constantly in flux. So sometimes one person will be struggling and sometimes another person will. And so we kind of just are comfortable sharing those resources as we need to. It's like, it just kind of makes sense because we know exactly what that looks like. But yeah, if one person is like consistently kind of growing in their career or something and another is not, I can imagine that becomes tougher. And that's because of our culture of money, right? It shouldn't be. It should be easy to share resources among friends so that you can enjoy your life together. But it's not because there's so much shame attached to not being able to pay for things yourself.
There's a post that I'll link in the show notes from a writer I really love who writes about like essentially like how to live in community with one another. And she says that we are afflicted with Venmo brain, where it's like, oh, we went and got drinks or we got coffee or whatever. Like, okay, let's split it exactly down the middle and I'll Venmo you and that sort of thing. And trying to like always create this equity, which I think like the mindset is in the right place where people who, maybe don't spend as much at a restaurant or something like that are like, well, okay, well, I can divide out the bill and like we can make sure that everyone, like all of this is equitable. And what she suggested is like when you have any sort of relative abundance, and that doesn't mean you have to be rich, right? It can be like you feel rich, which like feeling rich can mean so many things, right? It can just mean that you are comfortable with the money that you have.
Right. That's why I like the word abundance more, even though it's like got a kind of a religious tinge, but I feel that it has a little more room for interpretation.
Yes. And like, just be like, I got it. Whatever. You don't have to be so exacting with these things that make it so that you always are trying to like even out all of your expenditures between everyone that you know. Obviously, this is different if it feels like you're constantly being taken advantage of or something like that. Like that's an unhealthy dynamic. But I think when people are bringing something to a potluck, bring more. Bring something that you could leave at that person's house, not in an annoying way, but like like I got extra of this food item that like will last you for the rest of the week. Like just practicing abundance in that way. If you have something like part of your property or part, like, I don't know, some, like a lot of people that I've interviewed for my book talk a lot about how they are very transparent about like, anytime you need a food processor, come get my food processor. Like every item that is in my home is also essentially in your home. And that's especially with people that I've interviewed who are living close to one another. Like some of them have a Google sheet actually that has like every outdoor implement. So like if you need a hoe, you don't need to go buy a hoe. Like we can share this hoe. Do you know what I mean? Or so we have this little shack on our property that I was like, oh, I'm going to use it for dahlias. And some friends of ours live in a really small space where they don't have any like place where they could do like a weightlifting routine away from their kids. But then they also had, from the place where they used to live, they have like a lot of weightlifting materials. And so a bunch of people, a bunch of our friends like came together and DIY'd this space. They like put down gravel on the bottom and flattened it and put down some cheap plywood and then like painted all the interior. And now and it has like a space heater, and now it's the shred shed, and like anyone can come use it. Like I was at a party the other day talking to like a friend of a friend and who lives on the island, and I'm like, yeah, if you want to use it, just come by. Like it is an actual friendship space,
right?
Which sounds weird for a shred shed, but like thinking about that, and like, yeah, we pay the electricity for it, but who cares?
Even just the way you're saying it, where you're just talking to someone about it and saying, if you want to use it, come by. Like, I do think that is kind of a way into those conversations, is truly just to like start bringing things up. Just if someone's talking about gardening, just be like, I've got a ton of gardening tools that I am not using 24/7. So you should come over and use those. Like, I would love, and I always, when I'm trying to be generous too, like I try to really make a point of it, because so many people make offers and say things that they aren't really comfortable following through on. So like, I will really say like, and I mean it, I would really love if they would find a home, like that kind of thing. And it just helps people feel more comfortable doing that. I also try to take, like, I kind of got this advice from people who talk about like helping people who are grieving, is think of something that you can do for someone or that you can give to someone, and just essentially offer it without a way for them to turn it down.
Yep.
Like, I think like, and also think about what you can offer that is truly helpful. Like, my sister has 4 kids, and she and her husband both work full time. She does not have time for things, right? So one of the biggest things that anyone can do to help her is to make a meal for her family. So when I have an opportunity to do that, like, I'll just say, can I bring over, you know, what time are you free tonight? I want to bring over a casserole or whatever. That my Midwest just came out. Because that's what it is. It's a big family. But instead of saying like, hey, it seems like you're really busy right now, let me know if there's anything I can do to help.
Yeah.
Like, people don't know how to ask for that help. So just pay attention to what the needs are and start to offer that. And you can start to kind of model that sharing of resources for people and sharing of time.
The other last thing that I'll say that people often say in the threads is like, it is totally okay to just give your friends cash. And I think that we are often told that like, oh, that would be weird for them. Mm-hmm. I once needed a plane ticket to go to a funeral, and the family of the person who died knew that, you know, I was a grad student, like I didn't have a lot of money. And they gave me actually a cashier's check. They were like, if you don't spend this, like you have to spend this, like essentially like you cannot say no to us. And I think about that a lot. Like if someone's telling me about like they're in, like things are hard, like, and if I have abundance at that moment in some capacity, like why can't I just give them? And like it could be a loan, it could not be a loan, like whatever it is, if you have those means, like it is not weird. In fact, it is loving to give money to friends. So
right.
Okay, so next question is very up your alley. It's about whether budget advice is one size fits all. Let's hear from Haley.
I have a 22-year-old friend who is completely on her own. She was in foster care and is now estranged from her adoptive parents. She's working full-time and wants to start college soon, but she can't figure out how to afford to live. I've tried helping her with my 30-something-year-old person budget tricks, but I was naive to think that the same tricks would work for someone who's barely holding on. What advice do you have for someone who doesn't have a lot of earning potential, has little community support, and no higher education?
Okay, so let's do this in 2 parts. I know that you are not a specific advice person, but someone in this situation, what would your advice be?
So first I want to say, like, good for you for recognizing, like, learning that what worked for you is not going to work for someone else. Like, that's a really good lesson to learn. But I think a situation like this is really tricky to give advice for, because part of what this person is dealing with is probably all of these systemic things that we're talking about, like it being difficult to get a job without a college degree, not being paid enough money for the work that she's doing full time, the cost of housing, and the kind of strain that that's putting on those resources. So some of it is like, there might not be something you can do individually to feel more comfortable. Just let go of as much shame as you can and understand that this is something that's being put on you because of the system that you're part of. And I do think that's important, just to help people like relieve a little bit of that stress and shame.
Yeah.
But also, Haley mentioned that she's has little community support. And so I don't know exactly what that means. I'm going to take it to mean that like there's, not like friends and family around that could support.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would recommend is looking at community and government resources, like I mentioned, to expand what she's able to do with her resources. So if a ton of money is going toward housing, maybe she can look into a food bank or the SNAP program to get help with buying food, maybe housing vouchers or something, or low-income housing, nonprofits in the area that can help with some of those costs that are kind of pulling from her resources. A lot of that is, it's stuff that's in flux. I know the response I'm seeing from people a lot now is like, do you think those programs are still going to exist under the new administration?
Right.
So that is important too. And so I don't want to say it lightly, like just use government resources. And those programs have never been sufficient either. They're hard to access. But some things, like depending on where you live, I lived in Berkeley, California, and used a food bank at that time. And there it was like, just walk up and they give you a bag of food. There was no income restrictions, anything. So depending on where you live, something like a food bank is a really good resource if you can get to it. And so find the things that do work for you and that don't put a bunch of extra strain on your life because you have a bunch of, government paperwork to fill out or something. And I would also recommend that, depending on her financial situation, if she's not already using debt resources, to consider how she could use those in her life. And since she's young and she's kind of just getting started, I would say also take the time to essentially study those a little bit, like understand how credit cards work, understand how the interest works when you get charged fees, how the balance kind of rolls over and can grow, so that you understand what you're dealing with. Mm-hmm. But if it's something like she's trying to get into school, she's trying to just sort of get to that next phase, something like that could be really helpful. And I had a friend who called it planned irresponsibility when she was in grad school, used a lot of credit card debt, knowing that when she left that she was going to be facing a big balance and was just okay with that because she knew she would be in that next phase. And that can be something that's really helpful.
So first of all, I know that Haley did not ask for advice on how she could help. But one thing, if she has some resources on her side, is that she could help navigate some, like, the paperwork portion of this, because sometimes it is purposely frustrating because it's trying to get people not to use it. Mm-hmm. So if you have someone who is beside you who's like, okay, let's figure out this paperwork. I have the endurance to figure this out and I'm going to help you. Again, you want to have a conversation and have that person's consent and all of that sort of thing. But I think that could be like, and also like a time to spend with one another. And then the other thing I would say, well, there are, in many states, not all, but in many states, there are resources as well for people who are coming out of foster care, who are still in the transition period, the young adulthood period. So that might be something to look into. And again, Haley, that's something you can kind of Google around and see if it's available. The other thing is, if this person is interested in college, there is a reason why there is an incredible pool of money that is out there for people to have, that there are not a lot of barriers to access. And yes, interest rates are not low right now, but they are exactly what they were when I consolidated all of my loans. And also, the loans include, most of the time, like, you can access funds that will also cover your cost of living, because there is not an expectation that everyone who is going to school will also somehow magically have money to pay for housing. So that is one option. And I think, whether it's community college, whether it's a 4-year college, like whatever it is, those options are available. And there are also many programs that waive fees for people, like application fees to get into school if you are at a certain income threshold. So I think that's another thing that I would recommend if this person is interested in higher ed. And it also, stay away from predatory for-profit colleges that offer a ton of money. Like, they just dangle, like, you won't have to pay anything for 4 years. Like, those are the programs that you want to try to avoid. But anything that, like, an actual community college, anything that is state-sponsored in some capacity, there are going to be really cool programs there to guide you, and also resources in most of them. Again, these are things that might be cut, so we can't say that they're going to be there, but most of them have resources for people who are first-generation college students coming from backgrounds where they don't have a lot of support, all sorts of things. So those things are available.
a big part of it too, like you mentioned, she's working full time, barely making enough to live. I think a lot of times people in that situation who are like just able to scrape by enough to pay for things themselves, a lot of what you need is just that mindset shift to understand that you can use those resources that are available to you.
Yep.
Those student loans could be really valuable, the community and government resources, that you might qualify for that without realizing it, because you kind of imagine it to be just aid for the people living in abject poverty. But it's made to help people in this situation get out of this situation, in theory, and get to that next level. So, and also, like, you don't have to meet some moral standard to qualify, like, just if you can get your hands on those resources, use them.
So our next question is related, and it's going to bring up a lot of feelings. It's about another thing that we've been talking about in the last question too. This comes from Danielle, and Melody's going to read it.
I still struggle to see debt as a resource rather than a problem, especially with current interest rates. I have a credit card and mortgage, so I see how I benefit from this, but as a former Dave Ramseyer, it's hard to not see it as very, very bad. Are there any tips to shift my mindset a bit?
Okay, so can we first talk about why is debt bad? Like, why does Dave Ramsey hate debt?
Could you, from your perspective, Melody, can you share why Dave Ramsey says debt is so bad?
Basically, because then you're still paying more to be able to spend money.
Does Dave Ramsey believe in mortgages?
You are allowed to have a mortgage.
That's debt.
But you should pay it down as fast as possible. Right. He also says the FICO score is an I love debt score. And how stupid is that? If you have a good credit score, it just means you have a lot of debt.
Oh, wow.
Or something.
Wow. Does he believe in car payments?
No, you should only buy a car in cash.
When I bought my car, granted, this was in 2017, it was like the total amount of interest that we ended up paying over the course of the 5-year loan was like $250.
Doesn't matter. That was stupid.
It could have been less.
You should have done what I had to do when I was in DC, which was to find the crappiest Toyota available, and I paid $1,300 cash, and I drove it for 8 years or something. That's what everyone should do.
I bought a new car, but it was like a good, cheap car that still is alive.
You should never buy a new car. That's extremely stupid.
This is all very enlightening.
Just Melody. I love too that the accent goes in and out. Because sometimes it's Melody, that's her voice. She's like,
that's my internal voice versus But basically, he frames debt as like a prison, and that you'll never be able to. He wants everybody to get to, allegedly, he wants everybody to get to a place where you have no payments other than like your electric bill. And that's true financial freedom, is that you're not paying for anything.
Well, and a lot of this is like rich people debt good. Right? Rich people are allowed to leverage themselves in all sorts of capacities, but poor people debt very bad.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think there are a couple of philosophical things I think that are important to understand. Like, from one point of view, and if Dave Ramsey were talking about it this way, I would be on his team to rail against debt, which is, it's ridiculous that we have this elite class of a few people and institutions in our country that hoard all of the resources and then charge us money to access them.
Yeah.
That discrepancy is ridiculous. So if we were looking at it that way and saying that it's absurd that if I use my credit card to buy food for my family, I have to pay money to US Bank or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That we can be mad about. But on the other end, philosophically, I think it's also a little bit silly to look at something and say, if you pay interest, then you're just paying more for the things that you're buying, as if the price that you would pay in cash is the correct price for it,
Right.
Can, if you're using a credit card to live, you can just consider that the interest that you pay is part of the price that you're paying for the thing. There's no correct price.
Right. So it's almost like he's using, again, or tapping into this feeling that people who have debt are suckers, right? Because they are somehow paying, like, they're paying the full price, whereas, like, I only pay the sale price. Like, this attitude, I think, infuses so much in America that, like, you must always be getting a deal. And if you don't get a deal, then you're a sucker, right? And I'm
Absolutely.
like, no, but I want to buy those pants from the Gap now. I don't want to wait until they go 40% off in, like, 4 months or whatever.
Right. Or until I've saved up the money to buy them in cash. Yeah, that's definitely the attitude that I grew up with in a working class community, was this idea that using debt is irresponsible. And I think it's tied to that never wanting to be taken advantage of. And I imagine it's because we spend our whole lives as largely as Americans, but I think in particular in working class communities, that we spend our whole lives with the culture just taking advantage of us, constantly making us pawns and suckers and things. And so we're always looking for ways to avoid that humiliation a little bit.
Yeah. I also think that one way, like, some people I think are so conditioned to think of, like, okay, if I do take out any debt, I need to keep it as small as possible. And I answered a question in the comments on our original interview where someone was like, what's an example of, like, taking out more debt is good? And I pointed to the example of, I took out a lot more debt than I strictly needed when I went to graduate school because I took out enough to live. And when I say I took out enough to live, like, I was not living extravagantly. Like, again, I was buying the cheapest olive oil, and most meals I had, like, beans and, like, zucchini and a fried egg on top. But I also always took out enough to pay for plane tickets to, like, go to my friends' weddings, right? Like, I didn't go to all the bachelorette parties. Like, I couldn't participate in everything, but it was important to me to not, like, become this ghost for the 8 years of my graduate career, right? Like, I knew that if I want those friendships to still be there, like, it's not that I need to, like, spend exactly the same way that my friends were spending, but I need to also have the capacity to be there. And I bitch about my student loan debt all of the time because I think that, like, graduate programs should be funded and that graduate students should be paid more than $700 a month for, like, the work that they do. But at the same time, like, I don't regret taking out that debt because it allowed me to be a participant in my friendships. And so to me, that's an example of, like, wielding debt.
Wait, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
How were you confident that you would then make enough to be able to pay it back in a way that wasn't devastating? Like, I asked this because I got into really bad credit card debt. As I'm saying this, I still feel the shame. I got into credit card debt a few years ago, and it got to be where I couldn't afford the monthly payment. And I had to go, like, do one of those programs where they, like,
debt
renegotiate.
Which is a great program, and people should take advantage of them.
Yes,
and I think they get
highly
ashamed
recommend. It will save your life. It saved us. But yeah, like, how were you able to take out quote unquote extra, knowing you would be able to afford to pay it off?
Well, this is something that people rail against with graduate loans, is that there is that capacity to take out extra. And so they were still debts, like, these were still loans with the federal government. And so I knew that at the end of my time, I could consolidate them into one payment, and then that payment would go on income-driven repayment. So, which meant it would always be a percentage of my income. And it was a real struggle when I first moved to New York because there is no calculation. There's no calculator that takes cost of living into account. So, like, my payment was manageable when I lived in Walla Walla and made $50,000 a year. And then when I moved to New York and made $65,000 a year, which is what I was making that first year, like, the payment was not manageable, right? It was a significant portion. And eventually BuzzFeed started paying me more. But I also knew that if I paid on income-driven repayment, even though I was no longer eligible for public service loan forgiveness, that if I did my payments for 20 years, then the remainder would be forgiven. And so that's why people talk about student loan debt as, like, good debt.
That's kind of my basis for understanding debt, because that one has so many relief options. Yes. But I think you can apply that to other types of debt. So that's my biggest response for Danielle, is to shift that mindset from thinking of debt as very, very bad. Yeah. What you need to do is understand how your debt product works.
Yeah.
So all of the answers you gave are exactly that. So you understood that you could put that into a consolidated loan and do income-driven repayment. So you knew that you weren't just going to have this $900 a month payment hanging over your head. So it wasn't about knowing that you had enough money to pay it off. It was about knowing what your options were going to be and that you had a way to reduce the burden of that debt on essentially your monthly costs.
Yeah.
Rather than thinking about how am I possibly going to pay this debt off? And that's when we start to kind of moralize it, is thinking that you're planning for forgiveness after 20 years of income-driven repayment, instead of thinking, how can I pay back this money to the banks that lent it to me?
I should also note that I used my federal student loan money to pay off a private loan that I had to take out my first year of graduate school to cover dental work. So like sometimes you use that debt to pay off, like, because I knew that private debt, I couldn't fold it into the income-driven repayment. So I wanted to get rid of that and then take care of the other one. So
right. I did the same with a credit card when I was in college too. I used student loan debt because then I had 20 years to pay it off and it became much more favorable debt. You could do the same using like a home equity loan or home equity line of credit, which usually has a much lower interest rate and gives you like that 30 years of repayment. So it makes the impact really small for you. You could do it with a debt consolidation loan to deal with credit card debt, which could do the same thing, extend the time that you have to pay and reduce the interest rate. So just understanding that these options exist can help you then decide which types of debt can be beneficial for you. And also sometimes, like I did all that when I was in college. Like I just took the maximum student loan refund that was available to me and used that to live because I needed it at the time. I didn't know what my options were and I learned them later. So you can also do that retroactively if you're dealing with this kind of mountain of credit card debt that feels like it's going to be suffocating for you, rather than burying your head because it feels so shameful to look at that and it feels like it's just going to be overwhelming no matter what. Start to look into your options on how to deal with whatever kind of debt that you're dealing with. There's probably more than just paying whatever the creditor or lender is asking you to pay on any particular bill.
Okay, we're going to dig into even more questions for our paid subscribers about whether or not you have to buy a house, whether it's a wise financial idea to be a stay-at-home parent, whether the things we learned about saving money make any sense, and whatever's up with the no-spend trend on social media. So if you want to continue thinking about budget culture, head on over to culturestudypod.substack.com and sign up today. Dana, I cannot thank you enough for spending so much time with me working through these questions.
Yeah.
But we got so many questions. And when Melody first sent them to me, I texted her back and I was like, all of these are good. Like we could do all of these questions.
Yeah.
So, which is why we had so many and we didn't even get to all of them.
Well, feel free to direct people because I do an advice podcast through Healthy Rich too that I'm always open to new questions. So tackling stuff like this, I can do like a whole episode on someone's question too. So if we didn't get to it, they can check that out.
Do that. And also subscribe to Healthy Rich, the newsletter, which is one of my favorite reads. And where else would you like to direct people?
Yeah. So you can find the newsletter through Substack or healthyrich.co and subscribe. And then you can learn more about You Don't Need a Budget at youdon'tneedabudget.com.
Amazing. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. And if you want to support the show and get all of the bonus content, like today's full episode, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment every single week, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And if you're already a paid Culture Study newsletter subscriber, you get a huge deal. You need to click on the link in the show notes in order to receive that deal. It's not automatically applied. The Culture Study podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.